Hello.
Oh, hello.
Wow, this worked. It worked.
It's very exciting.
I know. Okay, well, welcome to our Instagram live chat for Queer Rural Connections, Chris. I am astounded that I was able to make this work on the first try, so this is very exciting. Before I let you speak, I'm just going to introduce you briefly for anyone who doesn't already follow you on Instagram, and they should if they don't already. But I'm here today with Christopher Adams, who is a playwright and screenwriter. He's also a PhD student at the Institute of English Studies School of Advanced Study at the University of London, and he works on the publishing history of queer fiction in Britain after the Second World War, examining how and why queer books were published in an era where homosexuality was criminalized and deemed obscene. In addition to his writing and research activities, Chris collects books and manuscripts related to post-war queer writers. And if you are interested in queer writing, queer books, all things queer literature, you should definitely follow Chris on Instagram because there's a lot of that there. And you are at queer_books. So welcome, Chris.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me. It's very exciting.
Great. Well, let's get started by talking a bit about your area of interest, your area of research. Tell me about the publishing, why you're interested in the publishing history of queer fiction. And let's kind of break that down into 2 points if we can. Let's start with what is queer fiction? What are we talking about? And then why would the politics of publishing in relation to queer fiction be a worthwhile topic for study and examination?
Cool. Yeah, so I work on queer fiction publishing after the Second World War. And I guess in terms of what I'm studying is kind of the moment in mostly gay and lesbian fiction where publishers and mainstream publishers start to publish gay novels, lesbian novels, bisexual novels, queer novels in increasing numbers. Kind of during this period that I'm studying, from 1945 till 1967 or a bit later, in this sort of 20-year period, there were around 600 novels featuring gay, lesbian, bisexual characters published by mainstream British publishers. And you can actually chart the number of these titles increasing throughout the 50s and then into the 60s as things like obscenity law starts to change in 1959, and as there's a movement toward decriminalization of male homosexual activity in 1967. So that's kind of what I'm looking at when I use the term queer fiction. Yeah, I just mean broadly books that center queer experiences or have queer characters either as their protagonist or even as sort of secondary characters. And I guess to go to your second point of what's interesting about this, or what I find interesting about this, is that in the study of queer books themselves, so the book as physical object, so like as a book, its physicality tells us something about the queer experience. So I'm interested in questions like how publishers asked their authors to change or alter their manuscripts based on if there were queer incidences, or even things like terms of affection between women or between men. Editors were asking their authors to edit this stuff out. So I'm interested in how manuscripts were changed, but also in things like dust jackets. So this is Francis King's The Man on the Rock, but the editor of this book asked the dust jacket designer to make this image more heterosexual, essentially, to the image that we see now. Because he was afraid that the book would be too queer because of its content, and so the dust jacket itself becomes a way of marketing it as a safer work of fiction. So I think in in looking at books, looking at their text, but also their physical manifestations. It's a really interesting insight into the era, into how queer people were positioned within society, and how queer authors are starting to take imaginative leaps to kind of expand what it meant to be a queer person.
So it's really quite an interesting point of intersection that you're looking at there between kind of the content of the books themselves and the authors and their lives, but also the industry of how these books were published, promoted, disseminated, and then accessed by potential readers. Were these the books that you look at, were they easily accessible to the public, or were they kind of in general, especially the historical pieces that you look at, were they more kind of niche? Did you have to go someplace special to get them, or was that actually part of the publishing strategy?
Yeah, so because these were published by mainstream publishers, they were distributed to bookshops all throughout Britain. One thing that I've been looking at is W.H. Smith, which at the time period was responsible for something like 15 to 20% of all book sales in England. They were a huge distributor and seller of books.
Wow.
And so, what I'm really interested in is in how queer books tread this line between, sometimes they're trying to push the genre, and they're trying to kind of push what's acceptable in literature. But if they push too far, then something like W.H. Smith, which has this very kind of high street, family friendly reputation, won't buy their book, and or will refuse to distribute their book. And if they lose distribution through W.H. Smith, then the publisher loses out on some like a kind of a quarter of their sales or something.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm really interested in this question of the economics of queer fiction publishing, and how publishers price their books, their queer literature book, their queer books. So, for instance, this one is The Youngest Director by Martin Goff. And Goff himself was a bookseller. So he's a queer man writing queer male fiction, but he's also a bookseller. And he writes to his publisher, to Putnam, saying that actually, I think you could price this book higher. You could charge more for this book because it's a queer book. And queer people are willing to spend more money to read literature about themselves. And that's kind of an interesting insight of sort of the economics of publishing, of we see in the 1950s and 60s queer people becoming a market that publishers are slowly becoming aware of, and whereas previously they might have been hesitant to actually market queer material explicitly, when they realize that, oh, there are queer people out there who are willing to pay money to buy books, then they start to produce more of them. And I think the aspect of buying the books is important as well, because Britain largely was a nation of book borrowers. So circulating libraries and public libraries did roaring trades in novels. But for the publisher, that wasn't really great, because they sold the book to a library one time and then 50 people checked it out. But with queer literature, this wasn't the case, because if you imagine yourself as a queer person of the time period, going to a library and requesting that we're having to check out a queer book, you're telling someone else, you're telling the librarian something about you, potentially. And so another thing that Martin Goff says is that actually queer people are more willing to buy queer books because they don't want to have this borrowing interaction.
Sure. And today with the data trails that entails, there are a lot of kind of unforeseen consequences to that. And another thing related to what you were saying about pricing the books is that adds a whole additional layer of complication in terms of the relationship between readers and literature, because you price something higher, it turns out there's actually a lucrative market there. The pricing structure can become exclusionary in other unforeseen ways. But of course, I should emphasize we're not here just to talk about the publishing industry. We are actually mostly here to talk about the queer rural, which is the topic of the project that is hosting this talk, Queer Rural Connections. Which is led by Timothy Alsop from Turn of Phrase and myself. And what I'm kind of interested in hearing about is how rural settings come into the queer literature that you're looking at, Chris. I think that as we've discussed in some other talks, there tends to be kind of an overrepresentation sometimes in terms of the queer aesthetic of urban centers and metropolitan centers. But actually, there seems to be an English tradition of queer writers who come from the countryside, write about the countryside, talk about rural places and experiences, and in some cases actually living quite openly, it seems, with their partners in those settings. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the rural comes into the literature you work with.
Yeah, I guess one thing that's really surprised me is because I'm interested in the publishing history of these novels, but then I also read them for the most part to just get a sense of what's going on in them. And what's really struck me is that in this period, there really is this real, quite deep engagement with the countryside, and that the way in which, in kind of the present moment, we so strongly associate queerness with urbanness, urbanity, wasn't as strongly linked. Certainly, at the time period, you do get kind of a set of novels set kind of in London in really strongly queer, often queer male environments. So again, Martin Gough's the youngest director. This is Rodney Garland or Adam de Hegedus, The Heart in Exile, which was sort of like the key urban male text. Another Martin Gough novel is the Plaster Fabric, again set in London about urban queer men. But there's actually this whole other aspect of literature, both queer authors who were living in the countryside. So if you think of someone like Angus Wilson, Sir Angus Wilson, one of the most prominent, well-respected and out gay men writers during the time period. He lives in London for a while, but then in the mid-50s, he takes a flat in London, but his other residence is a place called Felsham Woodside in Suffolk, and he writes in many of his novels then, such as Hemlock and After, is set again in this milieu of the countryside, and the protagonist is a bisexual, kind of closeted bisexual man who splits his time between the countryside setting and London. Angus Wilson was really interested in gardens and gardening in the middle age of Mrs. Elliot. The heroine kind of spends this time of recovery and healing at her gay brother's nursery in Sussex, I believe. So he's in this book, The Wild Garden, he talks specifically about his use of flowers, of gardening imagery of the countryside as metaphor for places of healing, also places of kind of dogmatism. If we think of the garden, it has a restorative aspect to it, but it's also a place that's very ordered. There's management of the garden that goes on. He's kind of one example of these rural settings. A book that I just recently read is The Chinese Garden, which is a girls' boarding school novel. And actually, when we think about rural settings in queer fiction, boarding schools themselves are really important places because they're same-sex environments, and English novelists are really obsessed with like the sexuality or not sexuality of adolescents. It's really confusing for them. And so The Chinese Garden is set in an all-girls boarding school, and it's based, Rosemary Manning, the author, called it the most autobiographical of her novels. And it's set in a boarding school in Devon. She changes the location to Somerset, but her experience was in Devon, kind of outside of Exeter, in a large manor house with huge grounds. It had been it had been around for 500 years or so, and by the 1920s, when this book is set, it had been turned into a girls' school. But there's a Chinese garden on the grounds that's hidden and that's covered over, and the garden in this novel contains at its heart a copy of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, kind of the key lesbian novel of the 1920s and hugely influential. And so the garden and the countryside become this place of innocence and experience. The garden is falling apart, but it kind of represents the corruption of the school that's not willing to acknowledge the kind of positive aspects of queer love among its students. And so, yeah, I could kind of go on and on about kind of instances of the countryside when we think of kind of probably one of the most famous queer novels, Morris by Forster, written in 1913 or so, not published until the 1970s. But he writes in the afterword that he sees his two characters, two men, kind of going off into the distance, into the greenwood, roaming the countryside together. Is kind of the image that we're left with. So
I wonder if there's kind of if there's a distinction between the garden, for instance, as an outdoor horticultural space, and the countryside, sort of uncultivated, unstructured, and whether that's something that you've come across at all. But it's something that came into my mind as you were describing the garden setting, that there is something quite orderly about it. It creates kind of a particular aesthetic that perhaps the wilderness, let's say, another kind of rural aesthetic doesn't evoke.
I guess when I think about novels that have more of a countryside as opposed to a garden setting, the countryside in this instance becomes a place of encounter or of erotic possibility. So something like this book is Uncle Stephen by Forrest Reed, and who was a Northern Irish writer. And this book is deeply strange, deeply queer. It's kind of like a proto-Narnia. Its hero is, he's kind of 15 or 16. He goes to live with his uncle. It's all very queer. It's kind of magical, but also the magic is sort of Greek. Kind of going back to the roots of Hellenism and queerness.
Yeah, do you mean sort of mythological, like the magic is kind of...
There's in the house, which is in the countryside, quite remote. In his uncle's sort of inner study is this statue, this Greek statue, and it seems to be kind of controlling the magic or the action that happens. But I bring it up because the hero, whose name escapes me at the moment, kind of fairly early on in wandering around his uncle's estate, encounters a farm laborer, and they develop a close friendship, a passionate friendship. It's clear that the farm laborer is interested in in the main character.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think this is kind of in contrast to city settings, where if we think about the codes of conduct, or like the places that men, particularly the queer men in these novels, go to essentially cruise.
Mm-hmm.
They're very ordered. There are very set spaces to go. There's kind of codes of conduct. There's always the possibility that the police are going to discover you, that you're going to be punished, and there's always like an element of violence, that the person that you might be picking up might harm you in some way. But I think in the countryside setting, there's more of a randomness to these sorts of encounters, of kind of coming across people, and there seems to be something less, maybe less provocative, or maybe just less potential for violence. I don't.
Interesting.
Not true in every case, but
yeah. But perhaps maybe more natural violence, as you know, it sort of nature plays a potentially bigger role, potentially is a character in that space, and in a way that's a bit different from urban settings. You mentioned a moment ago Northern Ireland, and I'd like to return to that, because one of the novels I particularly wanted to bring up with you today is this novel, Obad. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
Chris, great. Which is by Kenneth Martin. And as I believe that it is set in a small town, and Martin is from Northern Ireland. Is that right? Could you tell us a little bit about that novel?
Yeah, so this is the novel Obad, which was published in 1957 by Chapman and Hall, who had published Dickens years before. And Kenneth Martin was 16 when he wrote this novel.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a queer coming-of-age tale about a 16-year-old who falls in love with a slightly older young man, and they have a sort of summer romance. And then at the end, the slightly older young man, who's a medical student, goes off to Africa for a research fellowship. But yeah, what I find remarkable about it, and then here's this is its American edition. Yeah, so Ken was 16 when he wrote this. And there's Ken right there.
Oh, wow. Is he 16 there? Is that him?
He would be 18 or 19 here.
Wow.
Yeah, so he wrote it when he was 16. It was published like the day before his 18th birthday.
Wow, what an accomplishment, yes.
Yeah. And I think what's remarkable about not only the novel, but about Ken's story, is that it really plays into these themes that you and Tim have been talking about. Of Ken was a gay, adopted, quite poor adolescent who was desperate to escape his home. And yet, so he was living in Bangor, Northern Ireland, a small seaside town about 12 miles outside of Belfast. And he moves to London with the 100 quid advance that he gets for this novel. He moves to London and is kind of immediately sucked up by the city, by its by the city's queer scene. But he's only 18 years old. And he's also existing in a world, kind of the world of publishing, which is heavily class-based. So many of these authors and publishers have gone to Oxbridge. They've all gone to kind of Westminster, Eton. And Ken has done none of these things. Ken hasn't even finished grammar school.
Wow.
And so he's this person coming from the regions, trying to live this London life, while writing, while trying to support himself. And yeah, I find his story fascinating. And he lives in London for 10 years, and then he decides to leave. He moves to America.
He moves to the US, you said, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
but he writes about a small, much more kind of small town, rural setting, even though he kind of, it sounds like in his younger years, followed this trajectory that Tim and I have discussed in some of the other talks of the kind of uh, queer flight, but it's not just queer flight, it's actually young person flight from rural settings into urban settings, you know, for more adventure, for more culture, for more education, you name it. Um, but it sounds like still Ken was writing about these kind of smaller, more rural places.
Yeah, so in Obod, it's set in his hometown of Bangor, although it's never named. What's really interesting about the novel is that it's almost totally de-Northern Irishicized.
Mm,
Kind of the language is flattened. There, the sense of place is, we know it's a town by the sea, a small town by the sea,
mm,
but kind of because of the time in which he was writing, he felt that kind of reflections of being Northern Irish would count against him
mm,
in terms of getting the book published. But at the same time, in terms of its regional setting, the two main characters, Gary and Paul, their love affair is conducted in the countryside.
mm.
Gary has a car, which is very exciting.
And important in the countryside as well.
Yeah. So Gary has a car
Mm,
and can drive them around the coastline of Northern Ireland, where they can go on picnics and snog in the fields, that sort of thing. And yeah, I went to Bangor last year, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful countryside, beautiful seaside environments with cliffs and everything. But it's definitely in contrast to the urban environment.
mm. Yeah. And another novelist that I know you mentioned to me as well, who deals in the queer rural quite a bit, is Mary Renault. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about her body of work and how she deals in particular with the queer rural.
Yeah. So Mary is one of the writers dear to my heart.
Mm,
Uh, and she's mostly known for her novels from kind of 1956 onward, that are set in ancient Greece, and they mostly involve queer male characters. And she works out this formula that because it's set in ancient Greece, these stories can be happy, they can be fulfilling, they can have queer, kind of gay and bisexual love affairs that aren't kind of predominated by the homophobia of the era in which Reynolds herself was writing.
mm,
Um, so that's one aspect of her work, and probably the most famous aspect of her work. She was hugely popular, and I think from what I'm figuring out, I think she's the most widely sold queer author of the era.
wow.
Hugely influential.
Mm,
But before she switched to ancient Greece, she wrote a series of novels, often with bisexual protagonists.
mm,
And so there's The Friendly Young Ladies, which was written in the war. So it's published in 1944, I think.
Very
And
neutral cover there. Like
yeah,
nothing on it.
no, just The Friendly Young Ladies, and you would
Yes.
have to like, yeah. So it's about two women who are living together on a houseboat on the Thames,
Mm, mhm,
um, and it's this countryside setting. One of the women works as a writer of Western novels, westerns,
mhm,
and her partner at the beginning is a scientific illustrator, and their lives are interrupted by the younger sister of one of these characters, who's come from Cornwall,
mm,
and is herself escaping her family So it's really interesting because it kind of subverts the notion of we run away from the countryside to the city, because this is, but the characters here have run away from the countryside to more countryside.
Hmm.
But they're really just trying to escape their families.
Hmm.
And the houseboat offers them kind of protection and this this environment, this social network around the river and the river community. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's her funniest book. She doesn't often do funny, but this I found hilarious.
Oh, brilliant. Well, that's a good recommendation, for sure. It might be kind of a silly question, but do there tend to be positive outcomes for the queer characters in the novels that you have encountered in your research, or is it a mix?
It's a mixed bag. One of the things I think about is generally my mental health and reading a lot of this.
Really?
Right. Some of it can be pretty grim. But it's always interesting the ways in which it isn't grim, and the ways in which the authors are subverting that, are pushing past that. I would say it's not frequently that people end up happily together, happily ever after. Again, like in Morris, that is the case. However, Forster didn't feel that he could publish it at the time when he wrote it, so it wasn't published until the 1970s when the conversation kind of moved on. So it's complicated, I guess I would say.
Okay.
But as I said before, I find it really interesting charting the way in which queer authors become more strident or aware of those queer people and wanting to tell stories, imaginative stories, or making that imaginative leap to a world in which they can have happy, fulfilling relationships, which is one of the reasons why I and lots of people like Mary Renault, because she found a way to do that. Her characters can have happy, fulfilling relationships. It's just set in the past.
And you did mention that Mary Reynolds is an author that's very dear to you, close to your heart. Why did you say that? Why Mary Reynolds especially?
I enjoy her novels. She's also one of the authors that I've done the most work on. So I'm based in Reading, and a lot of her correspondence with her publisher is here at the archive at the University of Reading. She's so biting, so funny. Like in her letters with her correspondence, she knows exactly what she wants. She has endless opinions about her dust jacket covers. This is the jacket for her very famous novel, queer novel, The Charioteer. She loathed it.
So that didn't go so well for her in the end.
No.
Yeah.
And she's just, she's great to read both her novels, but also in her correspondence.
So we will wrap up here in just a couple of minutes, but I do have just a couple of short questions left for you, Chris, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The first thing I wanted to ask was sort of beyond writers who wrote about or in the countryside, there is also kind of this more broad literary aesthetic of the writer kind of retreating to the countryside in order to be able to focus or be able to think in a different way, or open up their mind, or escape, as you've mentioned. Some of the characters in these novels do as well. And I'm wondering why you think the rural might hold this kind of allure in literature, and what you think maybe we can learn about that allure differently by looking at it through a queer lens in particular.
Yeah, I think for the authors, there's that element of escape or need for privacy. And in some of the, so with The Chinese Garden, I've also been reading Rosemary Manning's, she wrote 2 autobiographies. And she was a person who did this frequently, who kind of retreated to the countryside to sort of commune with nature, but also to write. And that was her writing space. and there's something about the city as being full of distraction, um, particularly full of queer distraction, because it's where the bars are,
Mm.
and it's where the kind of intense social networks of friends are. And so for the writer, and for the queer writer, it's important to remove themselves from that space. So similarly to Angus Wilson with his home in Suffolk, that's a space to kind of sit in his garden and write, and not be distracted by the endless parties attending when he's in. Yeah. So yeah, kind of what that could tell us from a specifically queer angle. That's a good question. Other than just the writers seem to associate the city and their city lives with distraction, with very particular queer forms through their social networks and social activities that distract them from the important business of being a serious writer.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wonder how much of that is kind of universal to many, many different kinds of writers, and how much of it is about, yeah, escaping a particular kind of culture that had taken root in urban centers. For instance, the various distractions of life, arts, theater, friendships, etc. Just because there are more people in urban places, so there's a lot more going on. But yeah, it does sound like something that's actually quite universally kind of felt across many writers' experiences. So my last question for you, Chris, is for anyone who is watching this or tunes in later and is interested in queer literature but kind of doesn't really know where to start, what recommendation or recommendations would you make of queer books that people should dive into?
Yeah, if you want kind of an introduction to queer post-war literature, I've already mentioned it several times. The Chinese Garden I found really incredibly well written. Girls' boarding school, and it kind of encapsulates the boarding school novel from the perspective here of Rosemary Manning. So great place to start. 1962, and other great novel, The Bod, from 1957, a queer male coming of age story. If you want something really trippy, Uncle Stephen I found just endlessly fascinating, like really weird, potentially very problematic, but yeah, would give it a read.
Definitely a conversation starter, that one.
Yeah. So, I've also been reading the work. I think he's an incredible, like if you just want to read a great writer, Denton Welch, who himself lived like in a cottage in Kent or something. Again, another one of these author figures removed from London, from the centre. This is Maiden Voyage. He only published kind of 2.5, 3 novels in his lifetime. He was hit by a car when he was 20.
Oh, no.
And died at the age of 33. We were like in his early 30s.
Oh, wow.
But he's an incredible writer. I mean, just the most gorgeous prose. And he writes so well about kind of adolescent longing and sexuality, or sort of nascent sexuality. So I would give him a read as well.
That's brilliant. Well, I realize I've already massively run over what I told you the length of this thing was going to be, but we actually have a question from a viewer, and I'm kind of excited about that. And so I'm wondering if you'd be willing to entertain a question from one of our viewers. Let me just pull it up here. I obviously don't know what I'm doing with Instagram Live, but let's see. Okay. Great. So the question is, I was wondering if you've come across the recent novel Miss Boston and Miss Hargreaves, also a queer novel set in the countryside. And I actually can't see the rest of this question, so I don't know what else is there. Can you see it? I don't know if you can.
It's nope. I have not come across that novel. Oh dear. Yeah, I'm also really bad at Instagram here. I've not come across it, but I look forward to reading it and to adding it to the list of
Cool.
novels.
It was good timing for that question because it's kind of like another book recommendation
Yeah.
right there at the end. So that's cool. Yeah, yeah, I'm learning a lot about Instagram Live as we go here. So yeah, I didn't even realize that there was a question thing. So yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. That's brilliant. And I think all that remains for now is for me to thank you, Chris, for joining us on our Queer Rural Connections talk today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun, and I hope I haven't like flashed too many books in the camera.
Oh no, it's brilliant. It's so great to be able to see the actual, because like you said, it's a tactile experience, it's a material experience, and being able to see the covers and the dust jackets is really, really kind of a part of understanding this literary canon.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Chris, and
Thank you.
take care. And thanks to all of you for joining us.
Right. Bye.
Bye.